In a move that caught many analysts off guard, President William Ruto recently welcomed a high-ranking envoy from Burkina Faso, Colonel Oumarou Yabre, to Nairobi's State House. The visit wasn't just diplomatic, it was symbolic. Colonel Yabre delivered a personal goodwill message from Captain Ibrahim Traoré, Burkina Faso's young military leader who has risen to continental fame and, in some circles, infamy. This meeting, held behind the polished walls of Kenya's presidential residence, is far more than a routine handshake between African states. It is a reflection of a shifting tide in Africa's political and diplomatic identity. President Ruto, known for his firm stance on constitutionalism and civilian rule, has repeatedly condemned military takeovers across the continent. His administration has often positioned itself as a torchbearer for democracy and stability. After the military coup in Niger in 2023, Ruto declared it a serious setback for Africa's democratic aspirations. His Foreign Affairs team echoed similar sentiments, especially Principal Secretary for Foreign Affairs Korir Singh Oe, who warned against what he called the normalization and dignifying of military regimes. According to Singh Oe, the growing embrace of leaders like Traoré by major powers and sections of Africa's civil society is a troubling sign that decades of progress could be unraveling. He called out the optics of Captain Traoré being publicly welcomed at forums like the Russia-Africa Summit, warning that such gestures dangerously romanticize authoritarianism under the banner of anti-imperialism. So why did Kenya, of all nations, now open its doors to an envoy from a regime born out of a coup? Why is President Ruto an outspoken critic of undemocratic transitions entertaining diplomatic overtures from Ibrahim Traoré? To understand this moment, we must rewind a few days to another event that took place on Kenyan soil, the African Chiefs of Defense Conference in Nairobi, hosted in part by the United States Africa Command, AFRICOM. The American delegation was led by none other than General Michael Langley, the commander of U.S. Africa Command and one of the most powerful military figures in Washington's Africa Policy Circle. General Langley arrived with concerns not just about terrorism in the Sahel, but about the rise of military governments that seem increasingly out of reach for traditional Western influence. Langley had recently testified before the U.S. Senate, accusing Burkina Faso of using gold proceeds to fund private military groups, possibly alluding to growing ties between Traoré's government and Russian-affiliated security forces like the Wagner Group. When questioned about these claims during his Nairobi visit, Langley stood firm. He warned that despite some military regimes claiming progress, Burkina Faso remains vulnerable to terrorist expansion, and he made it clear that the U.S. sees the increasing detachment from Western partnerships as a dangerous development.
Burkina Faso, a lot of great things going on to progress them forward, okay? But then when you look at the military part of it, knowing that that's the epicenter of global terrorism, it was my time to illuminate that this is probably their weakest point, and there needs to be sufficient resources going towards for the whole fight of terrorism in that country.
This is where the plot thickens. While Washington doubles down on its disapproval, Burkina Faso's leadership is doing something unexpected, extending diplomatic hands not just to the east, but also to key African peers like Kenya. The visit to State House Nairobi then wasn't just about conveying a message from Traoré, it was a strategic gesture, signaling that Burkina Faso seeks recognition from African powerhouses and doesn't want to remain boxed into an anti-West narrative. And Kenya, by accepting this diplomatic engagement, seems to acknowledge something deeper. Africa's internal realignment is no longer about who came to power legally, but who commands respect, control, and influence. Captain Ibrahim Traoré has become a controversial, yet captivating figure across the continent. At just 36 years old, he is Africa's youngest head of state, and his rise to power has been marked by fierce anti-colonial rhetoric, bold nationalistic policies, and a call for pan-African solidarity. Under his rule, Burkina Faso has expelled French troops, nationalized parts of its mining industry, and taken a confrontational stance against institutions seen as vestiges of neo-colonial control. Traoré has captured the imagination of millions, especially Africa's youth, who feel betrayed by decades of failed democracy, Western interference, and corrupt leadership. Across social media, he is lionized as a modern Sankara, standing up to imperialism and fighting to return Africa's wealth to Africans. To the West, he is a problem. To many Africans, he is a solution. And now to President Ruto, he might be both. Kenya has always walked a fine line in its foreign policy. It prides itself on upholding constitutionalism, yet it is also acutely aware of the evolving dynamics within Africa. The continent is no longer operating under a unipolar worldview where the West sets the tone. Increasingly, African countries are looking east to China, to Russia, to Turkey, and even to each other. A new kind of diplomacy is emerging, one that values sovereignty, strategic partnerships, and internal African solidarity above external validation. Ruto's administration may not endorse military rule, but it clearly understands that engaging with leaders like Traoré cannot be avoided. The reality is that Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger control significant natural resources, regional influence, and grassroots support. Isolating them has only pushed them further from the AU and closer to BRICS and alternative alliances. Kenya, by receiving an envoy from Burkina Faso, might be betting on engagement rather than exclusion. Diplomacy, after all, is not about endorsement, it's about strategy. And make no mistake, the strategy is evolving. Traoré's outreach to Ruto signals a desire to build African alliances outside of traditional power structures. For a continent that has long been treated as a passive recipient of foreign agendas, this represents a turning point. Whether you support Traoré's methods or not, his presence has forced Africa and the world to pay attention. He has reignited a debate that many African elites would rather avoiding who really speaks for the people and who is protecting the continent's long-term interests. President Ruto, by hosting Traoré's envoy, is participating in that debate. Knowingly or not, Kenya is saying that African issues must be solved through African dialogue, not dictated terms. It's not a contradiction for Ruto to hold democratic values while still engaging with alternative power centers. In fact, it may be necessary. The continent is in flux. And in this transitional moment, building bridges, especially within Africa, may prove wiser than building walls. Meanwhile, the West is watching closely. The presence of General Langley in Nairobi and his pointed remarks about Burkina Faso suggest that the US still sees itself as a key referee in Africa's security landscape. But the rules are changing. Africa is not just a theater of US and China-Russia rivalries anymore. It is becoming an actor in its own right. Leaders like Ruto, Traoré, and others are shaping their own scripts. Their decisions will define Africa's next chapter, not what Washington or Paris or Brussels prefers, but what Africans decide among themselves. This moment, this quiet yet potent diplomatic exchange in Nairobi, could be one of those pivot points we look back on years from now and say that's when the rules began to change. So, is Africa's respect being restored? It depends on how you define respect. If respect means compliance with external expectations, then perhaps not. But if it means asserting sovereignty, redefining diplomacy, and choosing one's own allies and path, then yes, perhaps this is exactly what it looks like when Africa begins to command respect again. President Ruto's handshake with Colonel Omaru Yabre wasn't just a gesture of protocol. It was a signal. Africa is talking to itself now, on its own terms. The message from Burkina Faso didn't just travel across borders. It pierced through paradigms. The continent is waking up, and whether the world is ready or not, the new Africa is here. And it's no longer asking for permission.